Thanks so much for being a part of this great first day of Talent Connect. I think the keynotes were amazing, and I was especially inspired by Elaine Welteroth and Lisa Lee. So if you went to that and you heard that discussion, I think today will be especially impactful for you. We're going to be talking about moving the needle, the journey from invisibility to inclusion. And I have the pleasure today of introducing Stacy Smith. Stacy Smith is a PhD from UC Santa Barbara. She is the associate professor at the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. She has started her own think tank, the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative, around increasing diversity in entertainment. Going through her bio and thinking about introducing her, some of the things she's done are incredibly amazing, and I think she's going to tell us a lot about them today with a lot of focus on the role of women, both in front of and behind the camera, and thinking about issues of diversity specifically from the Hollywood perspective, including analyzing pay inequities, and thinking about the ways that we can begin to address these issues going forward. She's written a number of scholarly articles in everything from the New York Times to Variety, and she's a much lauded professor and has won various awards from all sorts of different organizations at USC. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Stacy Smith.
Thank you. It is great to be here, and I just want to start off with a question. How many folks in the room watched the Academy Awards this year? Just by a show of hands. Okay, so a few of you. You know, truth be told, it wasn't a very good award ceremony, to be perfectly honest. I thought it was kind of boring. Don't tell the producers, I know we're live streaming, but that's just a reality. And so I had turned down the volume on the show itself, and until one particular person caught my eye. On screen, this actor received not only the nomination, but the award for Best Actress of the evening, and it was Frances McDormand. And if you were watching, you saw that she stormed the stage and had all of the folks that were nominated, that were females, stand up in the room. And there were very few. And she said at the end of her acceptance speech, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to leave you with 2 words tonight." And I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. The first word was inclusion. And so now I'm really interested. It's the end of the night. What is that second word going to be? And that second word was writer. Well, the inclusion writer was something I actually came up with in my office years before. And when she said that, I started screaming at my small viewing party in Beverly Hills. And I am sure you could hear me throughout Los Angeles because I didn't know that Frances McDormand even knew about the inclusion writer. And therein lies the moment that changed my mind, my life. Now, it was actually kind of a humbling experience because I had given a TED Talk and mentioned the inclusion writer, and it has been viewed over 1 million times. So I am certain that people must not have been listening at that moment when I talked about it on the TED stage. I also wrote a Hollywood Reporter op-ed about the inclusion writer, which nobody must have read. It took this woman catapulting that message. The writer I came up with, worked on with Fanchen Cox Giovanni, Kalpana Toggle, and members of my team. What we didn't do is we didn't heed the entrepreneurs and philanthropists. They called me immediately and said, "Stacy, you need merch. You need to get on this because if you don't, other people are going to profit off of what has been developed here and shouted from the Academy Awards stage." Now, I'm going to tell you about the inclusion writer towards the end of my talk because it's a solution to inequality facing across industries, but it was designed for Hollywood in particular. Now, what I want to do today is show you in storytelling the invisibility that's facing different groups and how do we solve it? How do we solve it economically? How do we solve it from a leadership perspective? And how do we solve it contractually by something like the inclusion rider? So, 2 quick things I want to say before I get underway. One, I want to apologize. I speak really fast, so if you can't keep up, different room for you. This is the fast room, okay? Secondly, I'm horribly depressing, so I hope there's drinks at the end of the day because you're gonna need it when we're talking about storytelling and storytellers in the industry. So let's get started. If you are interested in the top 100 grossing films every year, the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative at the University of Southern California has your answer. We conduct probably what's been referred to as the gold standard of research, looking at the top 100 domestic films every year, fictional films, and we evaluate every speaking or named character that's shown on screen, which is a very low bar. All a character has to do is say one word to be included in our investigation. Why? We want to compare it to statistics in North America and in the US in particular to see how the industry's doing. Then we look at every character for demographics, for domesticity, and sexualization to see how much stereotyping is actually going on in these types of narratives. So, the question that we've been working on since 2005 in my lab, we've worked with about 1,000 undergraduates at this point, is how inclusive is Hollywood when it comes to hiring practices, particularly on screen? And the answer to that question is very simple. It's not. If you were to look at the top 100 films over the last 11 years, 1,100 movies, 48,757 speaking characters, females are clocking in at less than 1/3 of all speaking parts on screen. Less than 1/3. 2007 is no different than 2017. There's been no change despite all the activism, right? No change despite all the press attention. And matter of fact, these statistics do not meaningfully differ than what's been observed on a small sample of films from 1946 to 1955. There's been no movement, which is something that often plagues companies, particularly at the top. For Hollywood, we see a stalemate when it comes to representation on screen for girls and women. Now, when we move to the leading characters, we see that the picture is just as bad. Out of the top 100 films last year, only 33 featured a female lead or co-lead, 1/3, yet females are 50% of the population. They buy 50% of the tickets at the box office. So the economics of it doesn't make sense. But what's really problematic is to your right. Only 4 of the top 100 films last year featured a woman of color in the lead. Now, what's interesting about these 4 films is that they all 4 feature a mixed race female lead. All 4. And I would argue that it's really only 3 because Demi Lovato played a Smurf, which was blue, so her identity as an actor is mixed race, but not as a character on screen. Now, we look at the nature of roles, and we see that there's a lot of stereotyping going on in Hollywood. And you can see probably sexualization in society and workforces and organizations, and this is a real problem. We know that objectifying images can lead to body shame, appearance anxiety, self-objectification among some female viewers. And we see here that females are far more likely to be shown in sexually revealing clothing, partially naked, and referenced as attractive than their male counterparts. Matter of fact, in animation, sometimes females are so thin that their circumference of their waist approximates the circumference of their upper arm, leaving no room for a womb or any other internal organ. Now, one of the things that's really important that I want to underscore is that when Hollywood says female, when corporations say female, when different groups say female, they typically are talking about Caucasian women. And so we need to change our language because what we've found in film, just like we often see in organizations, when you intersect data and you cross gender and race, you see an epidemic of invisibility appear on screen for women from different underrepresented racial or ethnic groups. What do I mean by this? Out of 100 films last year, 43 didn't feature a single black woman speaking on screen. Not one. In terms of the Asian or Asian American community, 65 erased females altogether, despite the successes of Crazy Rich Asians. 64 didn't feature a single Latina speaking on screen, and 94 didn't feature a woman from the LGBT community. It's important that when we use language, we have to think inclusively about groups, and we have to be intersectional in nature, because these data suggest when we talk about girls and women in Hollywood, we're primarily talking about those that are Caucasian, because these numbers are alarming. Now, I often talk to folks in Hollywood, and I tell them there's one simple solution to solve all of these problems. One, and this solution also applies to different organizations that are concerned with this issue. If you want to solve any of the patterns that I just put up on the screen or on the slides, all companies have to do is one thing: hire female directors. It turns out that, and I'm talking film directors here, not the way many of you use the term director. It turns out that having differences in positions of influence, having women in positions of influence actually changes the nature of the stories that get told. We have more girls and women on screen, more girls and women at the center, more racial and ethnic diversity, more women 40 years of age or older on screen, which is good news for someone like me, and women often hire other women. Right? So one of the easiest ways to diversify the talent pool is ensuring that you have diversity in top leadership positions, as we all know. However, Hollywood fails miserably at this. Across the last 1,100 films, 1,223 directors, only 4% of film directors are females. 4%. Out of that 4%, only 8 women of color are represented across more than 1,200 directors. 4 black women, 3 Asian women, it's actually only 2 because 1 Asian woman worked twice, and 1 Latina. 1. So when we talk about an inclusion crisis, we're talking about a space, an entire industry that has erased large groups of individuals that do not reflect the world in which we actually live, where 30% of the United States are Caucasian men and women, and 20% are underrepresented men and women. 30-30, 20-20. We see nothing like that in this industry when it comes to the cultural narratives that we're seeing, heard, and perceiving coming out of this powerful industry. So let's talk about why. What prevents women from being in these really top leadership positions, whether it's behind the camera as a film director or in the CEO or C-suite of a major organization? Well, it turns out that there's a lot of theorizing and research about this issue. Alice Eagley at Northwestern has devoted some of her career talking about this issue of role congruity theory. And it turns out that leadership is stored cognitively, often along traits that are masculine in nature. Things like being assertive, controlling, and tough. These are leadership traits that align very closely with being masculine. These things are intertwined when we fire off thoughts about what a leader should look like or what a leader should do. But leadership traits and femininity are stored far apart cognitively. Things like being nurturing, kind, and helpful are not the things that we typically think of when we ideate about who could be a leader. So women walk a very fine line. If they're too masculine, they're discounted for leadership because they're not feminine enough. If they're too feminine, they're discounted because they don't perceive or don't act like a leader would act in the minds of men and women. They are in a double bind. So let me illustrate how this happens in the film industry, but it probably happens in your organizations as well. This idea that being a leader and being a female are incongruous cognitively. First, women aren't projected into leadership roles because of this bias. First, they're not considered, and when they are considered, when they are thrust into these positions, they're often punished more harshly than their male counterparts. So we decided to do a test of this, and we talked to several folks, a couple of dozen folks in the entertainment industry, and we asked them, what are attributes of successful film directors? We took all of those attributes and put them into one of three bins: attributes that are masculine, attributes that are feminine, or attributes that are neutral in nature. And it turns out that the individuals that we interviewed, a couple of dozen folks, said 2-to-1 masculine traits over feminine traits when they were discussing attributes of qualified directors. And what we came up with, which is similar to the global phenomenon with managers, when people in the entertainment industry think director, they think male. So females aren't being considered, and they can suffer more consequences. And some of the attributes or characteristics of successful directors were things like directors have to be individuals like General Patton. They have to be tough as nails, aggressive, ambitious. They have to rally the troops. My personal favorite is that they have to be muscular, because we all know that film directors carry so many heavy objects on set in production, okay? Now let's see a real-world example of language reinforcing this idea that women as leaders might be a problem. If you look at The Hollywood Reporter, one of the top 3 films of 2017 was Wonder Woman. But look at this Hollywood Reporter headline. Warner Brothers is gambling $150 million with a filmmaker whose only prior big screen credit was an $8 million indie film. That $8 million film won Charlize Theron an Academy Award. So our language can perpetuate a view of leadership that is actually quite problematic. Now, beyond Hollywood, we see this played out quite a bit. When women speak out or they act in a masculine nature in terms of leadership, those attributes, being aggressive or assertive, we often see examples of them being punished because of this double standard that's applied to women in leadership positions. And I always like to point out to my students, I can't think of a better example than the Dixie Chicks almost losing their careers for just exercising their First Amendment right and privilege. But the way in which we think about leadership can really affect that consideration process, which I hope we talk about in a few minutes in Q&A, and then the experiences that women have as leaders. So what do? These numbers haven't moved in decades. Nothing seems to make them go to the right or to the left or budge them in any way that is important to seeing change. So we started asking a few years ago at the initiative at USC, what are the solutions to inequality in industries? And I just want to focus on a couple here of ways in which we could actually deal with invisibility and move towards inclusion and, more importantly, belonging, which is really the North Star in all of these conversations. So first off, when it comes to leadership perceptions, leadership is a particular form of bias. Different biases will have different solutions. And leadership really pertains to who gets to drive the ship behind the camera and who gets to be in the center of the story on screen. These are the big leadership positions. And what companies and what Hollywood and different industries really need to think about is the language that's used in organizations, the language that's used in how we describe leadership and leaders. And we have to make sure we're changing the leadership language so that it's not gendered, but it's as inclusive as possible so that no one with access and opportunity to those particular occupational opportunities, that no one is left behind because of the language or the identity that they have. We have to be more inclusive in how we think about leadership in terms of hiring. How do we do that? A priori, ahead of interviewing, ahead of consideration, ahead of your annual budget that you will be getting months, ahead of time. You have to develop standardized criteria and a list of who you want and standardized criteria for how you're going to evaluate talent when you find them. And that talent really needs to be evaluated based on objective and quantifiable criteria. Because that Hollywood Reporter article would have never been written if they had simply looked at Patty Jenkins' credits prior to being attached to Wonder Woman. It wasn't only this Academy Award nomination, but she was a decorated and lauded director and had worked quite a bit in television and was celebrated in film, and objective and quantifiable data would have led to a very different conclusion that we saw in the Hollywood Reporter. The other thing that we have to do is we have to get away from trusting our gut. Everybody likes to trust their gut and their intuition. And while that might be interesting, it might lead you to find people that look like you. And you might be missing out on the most amazing talent sitting in front of you, particularly if they make you feel cognitively or emotionally uneasy. And that's where, if you have objective criteria, it can hold those feelings of discomfort in place so that you can really select the best person for the job, not the person who either looks like you or you feel most comfortable with. So to move perceptions of leadership, we have to move away from intuition to more standardized metrics in terms of decision making. Now, I also talked about how on screen there's been very little change for years, and most of this change is driven by small roles in storytelling, the whole ecosystem. And so what we did with the inclusion writer, just to give you an idea, is what we wanted to do was short circuit the casting process. Casting directors, which are largely white women, are bringing in people quickly to audition for supporting and small roles, and if they see the word police officer, they grab a white male in their roster. If they see firefighter, they grab another white male. And so many of these numbers don't change because the heuristic and cues that casting directors are using short circuit that deep bench of talent. Women, people of color, members of the LGBT community, actors by age, actors by disability. So the inclusion writer specifies, much like the Rooney Rule, you have to interview and consider that deep bench of talent prior to hiring for those supporting and small roles. And if an A-lister puts this in their contract, they can then be held accountable, the production company, to ensuring that the world shown on screen looks like the world we live in. And the inclusion writer, we have stipulations for it on screen as well as behind the camera. All the information, all the mechanics of that writer are simply to ensure that people that are talented have the access and opportunity to interview for those jobs that typically they've been looked over for whatever reason. You can find all of the language of the inclusion writer at the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative website, as well as Pearl Street and Cohen Milstein, representatives Kanchan Cox-Giovanni, Kalpana Katagal also have access to the language if you want to adapt for your particular industry or your particular occupation. Now, to show you just how easy, if Hollywood A-listers adopted an inclusion writer, what could happen? We could see for the first time in Hollywood history equality in storytelling. If simply the top 100 films, if you added 5 female speaking characters to each of the top 100 films, 5 characters, set a new norm, repeated that process, in 4 years, 2020, we could be at equality on screen. It is literally mathematically that simple. It doesn't take jobs away from men. It ensures that the epidemic of invisibility is eradicated. It's very inexpensive, right? And we humanize the production process, which is something that needs to happen in Hollywood and the government, if you're watching what has been going on since the Harvey Weinstein case. Now, last and finally, there's an economic argument. And the myth in Hollywood has been that films with male leads or Caucasian leads make more money than films with female leads or stories with underrepresented leads. The reality is that may not actually be true because films with male leads have higher budgets than films with female leads. So is it the budget driving box office, or is it the gender of the lead character? This is where sophisticated economic analyses actually can challenge the mythologizing around decision-making in the executive suites of many of these film companies. So what we did is an empirical test that we're now replicating at the lab, and the results will be out in a few months. We actually found, looking at production, distribution, and exhibition factors of films, that what matters most isn't who the lead character is, their gender, if they're a female or not, but what matters the most is the stories that you put a lot of money behind, you put in a lot of theaters, and the stories that are received very well by critics. These are what sells, not the gender of the lead character. Turns out that domestically, it doesn't matter whether you have a female lead or not. It doesn't affect the profitability or the revenue coming in at the box office. But what our results have actually shown is that when you have a female lead internationally, you actually make more money. So we're in the process of replicating these findings because despite last year, Wonder Woman, Star Wars, Beauty and the Beast were the top 3 domestic films in the US. Despite the return on investment, despite that this is allegedly one of the most progressive industries, there's an inclusion crisis facing this industry that contractually can be changed, changing perceptions of leadership through storytelling and organizational culture can change, and by challenging the way in which business is done with more sophisticated economic models that can create change. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks so much. I think all of us here who are involved in the talent business, whether you're in HR or in recruiting, really feel the pain that you're describing here. And Stacy and I got a chance to talk before. I lead talent at LinkedIn. It's a high-tech company. We obviously are trying our best to combat this, but there is an institutionalized sense of many of these issues that you're talking about in Hollywood, in high-tech, and in many other industries. But I think what you've done here is shown how data can really help make that case. And when you talk about a casting agent and their role, it's very similar to many of us who are recruiters, who are working on getting butts in seats as soon as we can. And sometimes the pressure is to sacrifice diversity for speed. And I was just wondering, on that front, what do you think the best arguments for, or the way to call out to leadership, why it's important to pause? Well, we know that without pausing, you will simply replicate
the environment that you have. We know that that's where bias thrives, right? Really important high-pressure situations with very little time. People go to the same folks they always go to ensure that the job gets done in the way that it needs to get done. However, it's not going to work, right? I mean, the long game here is what is being left on the table. When half of the population is female, 40% is people of color, 20% are people with disability, 10% LGBTQ, and they're not reflected in storytelling, it seems like adventures in missing the point. If I wanted to make money, I would ensure that the stories I told reflected the demographics of the audience. And so slowing down is one way to ensure that your product will resonate and connect with who your consumer or audience base actually is. And this industry really doesn't understand that, and they haven't for years.
Yeah, but I mean, what you're saying, it exactly ties back to what we heard from Elaine Welteroth, former editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue, about if you want to change the story, you have to change the storyteller, which I think you're exactly saying with that role of the director and the importance of that. And I think one of the things that she mentioned was about how they wanted to get to their full audience and what their audience really wanted. And that seems like what your data is showing about the gross information. I think for many of us in high tech or any other company, we're thinking about our customers. If we want to get to all our customers, right, this diverse leadership makes the difference.
Absolutely.
One subset of audience that I want to talk to you about is that critics piece. You mentioned that the critics sort of recommendation makes a big difference in how a business does or how a film does. I was wondering, I don't know, how does that play and how do the gender roles factor in there?
Well, I think it's really important to think about critics in the ecosystem of a film. They come in at the tail end and they tell the audience what they liked or didn't like about the film, and they give it a score, right? And that score then translates into people like yourselves logging on to Rotten Tomatoes and saying, do I want to see or not see? Well, you know, it's a real interesting phenomenon when only 4 films out of 100 have a woman of color at the center, right? Only 8 out of 1,100 films have a woman of color behind the camera. And there's very few women of color on screen in smaller roles, and less than 4% of all critics are females of color. You have just created the perfect storm to miss an entire audience, because the critics, the leadership positions, and the storytelling just eviscerate a part of that segment that you want. So my question is, why would you listen to any of the decision makers? Because they are clearly not reflecting the needs of a huge base of the population that could be generating revenue. And the numbers are there in terms of viewership for television, digital platforms, or buying tickets at the movies. So I think that critics, we really have to say, are they the experts we want? Are the people in the C-suite the experts we want making decisions? I don't think so, and let me tell you why. I'm getting into scary territory, I'm sure.
You're among friends.
Among friends and the live stream. We interviewed over 50 thought leaders in Hollywood, and we asked them one simple question. Tell us who's on your consideration list as a female director of a film. These are some of the top buyers and sellers in the industry. Out of 59 people, the number of names of female directors that could be given to us, the mode was 0. The average was 3 because one person pulled out a list of 24 names and read them off, so it pulled up the average from 0 to 3. Now, this is a real problem because if you want people in your executive ranks really understanding the needs of your consumers and the people that are pushing stories and ensuring that talent has opportunity, they're just sidelining 50% or more of available talent. You really have to call into question, who are the experts making decisions? Because if this is about return on investment and engagement with your consumers, then I think we need to challenge who experts actually are. whether they're making decisions about a multi-million-dollar motion picture, or they're critics of a film, or they're in the executive ranks of a corporation.
Yeah, it's a great call out, and I think it really does make the argument, as you did, for using data. You know, there's a place for intuition, and there's a place for who you feel comfortable with, but if you have data, whether it's, you know, pulling up available people or qualified candidates and then forcing there to be a representative list, but it's really got to be done, because otherwise I do think people just revert back to what they're most comfortable with.
Well, and I think our favorite, why every time we hear someone's not being hired or they hire another white male, well, when it comes to women or people of color, there's just a small pool. There's just a small pool. And it's like they take these folks and they send them to camp and said, we're going to tell you all how to answer the exact same way when you don't want to hire someone that doesn't look like you, right? But the question is there really a small pool? And with our research on directors, that is in fact not the case. So we need data to challenge the nomenclature of and the language that limits access and opportunity, so that those folks can be exposed to the truth. That truth will lead to shame, and shame will cause change. I mean, it's a simple causal model.
Perfect. Yeah, and I mean, this is one of those moments when I feel like I must call out LinkedIn as a place where, you know, in any situation, you're more able to pull up the total addressable market and the talent available. And so things like that maybe could even help in a place like Hollywood.
Absolutely. I think it's the perfect admixture to a platform that really understands the plurality of the workforce and the dynamics and across different identity groups. How do you partner with an industry that really only has focused for decades on a narrow fraction of the population? And that's the synergy, I think, at the initiative in the groups that we've worked with. That's what we want to actually do, and have those unlikely pairings be the solution for change.
Yeah, definitely. So if you don't mind, I want to change gears and ask a couple questions about politics.
Okay.
You know, it's been a busy couple weeks in politics. And while I ask these questions, if anyone has any questions in the audience, we are going to leave a few minutes at the end for that. But I think Hollywood is in an interesting position because they've been definitely called out on the sexism with Me Too and Time's Up. And so then recently, when that sort of focus turned to Washington, Hollywood has been very outspoken about the Kavanaugh hearings and has been really a force there. And I wonder if what's just happened in politics, if you feel like that will actually help Hollywood move the numbers, as you've said. Do you think that will actually allow for more inclusion in front of and behind the camera as they sort of watch Washington and want to move further from it?
You know, it's been an interesting time the last year since Harvey Weinstein and that whole situation broke, which was just about a year ago. And we've seen so many different men come under fire. I think the formation of Time's Up is something we have never seen before in the industry. And the reason why it's so pronounced to me is women from all backgrounds are linking arms and taking control in ways that before they were often siloed. You know, actors wouldn't talk to other female actors, right? Because there was only one major part. Exactly. And I think some of the research is interesting to think about, where you have a real saturation of male-dominated employees or a male-dominated culture. It presents more risk for many of these very serious and problematic behaviors, whether it's microaggression, whether it's pay inequality, whether it's sexual harassment or sexual assault. And so I think we're seeing something that is truly extraordinary that will leave a historical legacy not only on entertainment, but other industries as well. And I can't tell you how important this is. One thing I didn't present with our data is that The real problem with women on screen is there are no roles really for women over 40. And this is problematic because no one is being socialized to what powerful women look like in leadership, because most of those parts go to male actors. And so to counter or to show experiences of how to navigate the experiences of women in Washington, you would think that we would have lots of stories about what we just saw. But the fact is, that's not true. We did a study out of 129 films. I believe it was 5,839 speaking characters, but fact check me if you have time or insomnia. We found across all of those films, there were only 3 political figures that were women that were high-level politicians. One played Angela Merkel, so that doesn't really count because it's out of the US. And the other 2 high-level politicians simply were referred to by name. They never spoke on screen. So what we're seeing right now, we haven't even socialized through storytelling what powerful female politicians look like and do. And yes, the last election, and yes, the last presidential couple played a big role in moving us in a direction to understanding that, you know, the folks in the White House can look very different than just, you know, a very narrow classification. But there's so much more that has to be done, and so many myths that still have to be challenged about harassment and assault in male-dominated and non-male-dominated arenas.
Great, thank you. I want to just open it up if anyone has any questions out in the audience. Does anyone have anything they want to ask Dr. Smith? Okay. You want to step up to the mic here, if you don't mind?
You're right there. One question I have is, with my current company being software, we're doing a lot of work to try and improve women in tech. One thing we're using is we're looking at how we write our job descriptions. So there's a thing out there called Gender Decoder, which basically tries to make a job description more applicable to a wider audience. The problem is, for very senior roles, you could argue it takes out a lot of the core personality traits, as you said, which are considered masculine. But that doesn't actually adhere itself to what the company necessarily wants, in that they want, you know, a challenger and a leader regardless of gender or, you know, what we would consider masculine or feminine. What can you see on the market right now which could help us in terms of becoming more applicable to a wider audience, but not compromising what ultimately the role needs to be successful?
I'm not sure about, and I don't know if you maybe want to answer this in terms of what's available in the market, but I'll tell you 2 things to be careful of. We know that when there's a lot of research on what's called social dominance theory, and social dominance orientation is really a personality characteristics. People are high and low on the degree to which they exclude groups. And interestingly enough, people in positions of power oftentimes are high in social dominance, which means they defer to the white male culture, right? Because that's where power is typically held. The challenge here is, how do you write a job description to ensure that you're attracting people that are low in social dominance orientation, which means they value diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So you have 2 things, not only externally how you communicate, but ensuring that your talent pool, you're not replicating the same mindset that might exist at the organization. The second challenge is people that are low in social dominance orientation may not be attracted to your organization. So you need to do testing to figure out, how are people reading that job description? How are people assessing the environment, whether it's people in the senior ranks, the actual physical structure? Because we know also from research that that affects people's perceptions of belonging. For instance, in computer science, a lot of women, the stereotypical ways in which tech companies are presented are two things that decrease desire and interest in even participating in computer science. So I think we have to think a little bit more outside of the box and outside of traditional just language, and make sure who we're recruiting have the traits and characteristics to build a workforce that looks different than maybe the one they're actually applying for or what actually exists. But if you reach out, I'm happy to send you that literature to take a look, because I think it might cause you to think a little bit differently about how to write those ads.
Great, thank you. And that does bring us to the end of this discussion. I want to thank you again. This has been a really insightful discussion, and I know that the audience really has something to take home and think about. So thanks a lot for having me.